Women over 60. What men consider great sex. 4 secrets. Relationship advice for women. Sex therapists who work specifically with couples over 60 have discovered something that contradicts almost everything we've been taught about what men want in bed. At this age, great sex for men has far less to do with physical performance or specific acts, and everything to do with emotional connection, authentic presence, and feeling genuinely desired. The athletic, performance-focused sexuality of younger years gives way to something deeper, more intimate, more about quality of connection than quantity of orgasms. This is liberating news for women who've worried that aging bodies or decreased flexibility would make them less sexually appealing or capable. Men in their 60s and 70s consistently report that the best sexual experiences of their lives happened after 60, not despite aging, but because of the emotional maturity, confidence, and authentic presence that comes with it. What they consider great sex at this stage has evolved into something richer and more fulfilling than what satisfied them in their 30s or 40s. But most women don't know this. We're still operating from outdated scripts about male sexuality, believing men want primarily physical stimulation, variety, performance, youth. We're anxious about bodies that don't look like they did decades ago, uncertain about whether we can still be sexually compelling. Meanwhile, the men we're with are hoping for something completely different. Genuine presence, enthusiastic desire, emotional safety, and the kind of intimacy that can only exist between people who've stopped performing and started being real with each other. Sex therapist Dr. Ian Kerner says, great sex is about connection and communication, not acrobatics and orgasm counts. This is especially true after 60, when the physical mechanics may require more patience, but the potential for genuine intimacy is greater than ever. If you've been anxious about sexuality at this age, if you've been unsure what men really want, or worried that aging has made you less desirable, you're in the right place. This channel is dedicated to honest conversations about every aspect of relationships, including the physical intimacy that remains important regardless of age. Consider subscribing if you want truth about what actually creates fulfilling sexual connection at our age, not outdated myths. We're building a community of women who understand that sexuality doesn't expire, it evolves, and is something potentially more satisfying than anything we experienced in our younger years.
Secret number 1. Feeling genuinely desired is more important than physical technique. The first thing sex therapists want women to understand is that men over 60 consistently rank feeling genuinely desired as more important to sexual satisfaction than any specific physical technique or act. This is a profound shift from younger male sexuality, where physical stimulation and variety often took priority. At this age, emotional components of sexuality become primary, and nothing matters more than feeling wanted by a partner who's enthusiastically choosing to be intimate with them. Robert, a 72-year-old man interviewed for research on mature sexuality, explained it this way. When I was younger, good sex was about physical intensity, how it felt, how many times, how adventurous we were. Now the best sexual experiences are the ones where I feel like my partner genuinely wants me, not tolerating my desire, not going through motions out of obligation, but actually wanting to be intimate with me specifically. That enthusiasm and genuine desire makes everything else better. This matters tremendously for women who've been worried about physical changes or decreased flexibility. What men at this age want isn't a body that looks 25 or a partner who can do acrobatic positions. They want someone who shows up with genuine desire, who initiates sometimes, who communicates through words and actions that she finds him sexually appealing and wants to be physically close to him. Margaret learned this with Thomas after decades into marriage where sex had become obligatory. In her new relationship, she made a conscious choice to be honest about her desire rather than performing availability. When she wanted to be intimate with Thomas, she said so directly. She initiated contact. She expressed appreciation for his body and what they shared physically. The effect on Thomas was profound. He told her repeatedly that feeling genuinely wanted was transformative, that it made him more confident and present than he'd been in years. Sex therapist Dr. Emily Nagoski's research confirms this. Responsive desire, wanting sex once you're in it, is common and valid. But expressing genuine enthusiasm when you do want intimacy, communicating that your partner is desirable to you, showing that you're choosing this rather than tolerating it, these emotional components create the conditions for satisfying sexuality at any age. Linda made a practice of expressing desire verbally with James. "I've been thinking about you all day," or "I love how your body feels," or "I want to be close to you tonight." These simple statements of genuine desire meant more to James than any physical technique could have. They communicated that she found him sexually appealing, that physical intimacy with him was something she actively wanted, not something she was providing as relationship maintenance. The practical application. Don't worry so much about technique or performance. Focus instead on expressing genuine desire when you feel it. Let him know through words and actions that you find him sexually appealing, that you want to be intimate with him specifically, that physical closeness with him brings you pleasure and connection. That authentic enthusiasm creates better sexual experiences than any performance could.
Secret number 2 is that men over 60 rank emotional safety during intimacy as crucial to great sex. This means being able to be vulnerable about what feels good, what doesn't, physical limitations, anxieties, desires, without fear of judgment or rejection. The performance pressure of younger sexuality gives way to something more honest, where both people can be real about what's happening, rather than pretending everything is effortless and perfect. Kenneth, 68, explained this shift. "In my younger relationships, I felt like I had to perform, always be hard, always last long enough, always know exactly what to do. Any vulnerability about struggles or uncertainties felt like failure. With Ruth, I can be honest. If something isn't working, we laugh and adjust. If I'm nervous, I can say so. That emotional safety makes the actual physical intimacy so much better because I'm not performing. I'm actually present with her." This requires both people to create space for honest communication about sex. Not just "that feels good," but real talk about bodies that work differently than they did decades ago, about medications that affect function, about needing more time or different stimulation, about fears and insecurities that come with aging. Helen and David established this emotional safety early in their physical relationship by having explicit conversations before intimacy developed. They talked about health issues, medications, what each needed physically, anxieties about aging bodies, what felt vulnerable for each of them. Those conversations created a foundation where they could be honest during intimacy rather than performing competence or perfection they didn't feel. Sex therapist Dr. Tammy Nelson emphasizes this. The couples who report a most satisfying sex after 60 are the ones who've learned to communicate vulnerably about sexuality. They can laugh when things don't go as planned. They can ask for what they need. They can be honest about limitations without shame. That emotional safety is intensely intimate and creates better sex than performing invulnerability ever could. Patricia noticed that intimacy with Martin was profoundly different from her previous marriage, specifically because of this emotional safety. Martin could admit when he was nervous or when something wasn't working, and instead of that killing the mood, it actually deepened their connection. Patricia felt safe being equally honest about needing more time for arousal, about positions that no longer worked comfortably, about insecurities about her aging body. That mutual vulnerability created intimacy that transcended the purely physical. The practical application: create emotional safety by being honest about your own vulnerabilities and receiving his without judgment. Talk openly about what your bodies need now, what feels good, what's changed, what you're nervous about. Treat imperfect moments with humor and compassion rather than disappointment. That safety allows both of you to be fully present rather than performing, and presence creates far better sexual connection than performance ever could. Have you experienced the difference emotional safety makes in physical intimacy? Share your thoughts in the comments.
Secret number 3. Men value quality and connection over frequency. The third secret that surprises many women is that men over 60 consistently report valuing quality and emotional connection during sex far more than frequency. This contradicts the stereotype of male sexuality as primarily drive-focused, where more is always better. Research on mature sexuality finds that men at this age would rather have deeply connected, emotionally intimate sexual experiences once a week than disconnected, mechanical sex multiple times a week. Thomas, 70, explained this evolution. When I was younger, I thought about sex in terms of how often, like there was some number that would prove virility or satisfaction. Now, I'd much rather have one really connected, intimate experience with Margaret than frequent sex that feels routine or disconnected. Quality matters so much more than quantity at this point. This is liberating for women who've worried that decreased frequency means failure or that their partners are dissatisfied. What men at this age actually want is sexual connection that feels meaningful, where both people are fully present, where emotional intimacy accompanies physical pleasure, where the experience creates closeness rather than just releasing tension. Susan noticed that Robert never pressured her about frequency. When they were intimate, he was fully present and emotionally engaged, but he didn't seem anxious or disappointed when weeks passed between sexual encounters if life was busy or bodies weren't cooperating. When she asked him about this, he explained that he'd rather have sex that felt truly connective and meaningful than frequent encounters that felt obligatory or disconnected. Sex researcher Dr. Peggy Kleinplotz's studies on optimal sexuality found that the best sexual experiences share common elements regardless of age: being fully present, deep connection with partner, authenticity, vulnerability, exploration. Frequency wasn't among the characteristics of great sex. Quality of presence and connection were. Linda had spent her previous marriage anxious about frequency. Her ex-husband had made her feel like anything less than twice a week meant something was wrong with her or the relationship. With James, frequency varied naturally based on energy, health, circumstances, and neither of them treated this as a problem. When they were intimate, it was fully present and deeply connected. That quality made occasional intimacy more satisfying than frequent but disconnected sex had ever been. The practical application: stop worrying about frequency as a measure of sexual success. Focus instead on being fully present when you are intimate, emotionally engaged, communicative, vulnerable, connected. Create experiences where both of you are genuinely there, rather than going through the motions. Men at this age value that quality of connection far more than any specific frequency.
Secret number 4 is perhaps the most important. Men over 60 report that physical intimacy beyond intercourse, touching, kissing, caressing, being naked together, non-genital physical affection, is often as satisfying or more satisfying than intercourse itself. This contradicts decades of messaging that real sex equals penetration and that everything else is just foreplay or consolation when real sex isn't possible. Richard, 69, described this evolution. "I've realized that some of the most intimate, satisfying physical experiences with Carol have nothing to do with intercourse. Sometimes we spend an hour just touching each other, exploring, being close without any goal or endpoint. There's something incredibly intimate about physical connection without performance pressure, where we're just present with each other's bodies and pleasure without needing it to culminate in anything specific. This shift is partially physiological. Erectile function changes with age. Medications affect response. Bodies require more time and different stimulation. But it's also psychological and emotional. Men at this age have learned that reducing sex to a single act misses most of what makes physical intimacy satisfying. The touching, the emotional connection, the vulnerability of being naked together, the pleasure of giving and receiving non-goal-oriented physical affection. All of this becomes valued as intrinsically satisfying rather than merely preparatory. Margaret and Thomas had explicit conversations about this after Thomas experienced some erectile difficulties related to medication. Instead of treating this as a crisis or the end of their sexual relationship, they explored what other forms of physical intimacy felt good. They discovered that they could have deeply satisfying sexual experiences that didn't involve intercourse at all. Extended time touching each other, oral pleasure, using hands, being naked together, and exploring sensation without any specific goal. "It actually freed us," Margaret explained. "When we stopped defining sex narrowly as intercourse, everything else became real intimacy rather than just steps towards some endpoint. We could be physical with each other without performance pressure, and that often felt more intimate than goal-oriented sex ever had." Sex therapist Dr. Barry McCarthy's research on good enough sex emphasizes this. Couples who maintain satisfying sexuality after 60 are the ones who embrace a broader definition of sex, where intercourse is one option among many rather than the only thing that counts as real sex. This reduces performance pressure, increases options, and often leads to more creative, satisfying physical intimacy. Helen and David made a practice of regular physical intimacy that wasn't oriented toward intercourse. Extended massage, lying naked together and touching, taking baths together, spending time in physical closeness without any pressure for it to lead anywhere specific. David told Helen repeatedly that these experiences were among the most intimate of his life, that the absence of performance goal allowed him to be more present and vulnerable than he'd been able to be when physical intimacy always needed to culminate in intercourse. The practical application: expand your definition of sexual intimacy beyond intercourse. Make time for physical connection that's about pleasure, closeness, exploration, without a specific goal. Take pressure off intercourse as the only thing that counts as sex. Men at this age often find this broader, more exploratory approach to physical intimacy deeply satisfying, more so than the goal-oriented sexuality of their younger years.
What gets in the way? Performance anxiety and shame about aging bodies or decreased function. Understanding what men consider great sex also requires addressing what gets in the way of it. Sex therapists consistently identify two major obstacles: performance anxiety and shame about aging bodies or decreased function. Both partners often carry these, and both undermine the authentic presence and emotional safety that create satisfying sexuality at this age. Male performance anxiety centers on erectile function, duration, ability to satisfy partner. Men worry that decreased firm erections or inability to sustain them means they've failed, that they're no longer real men, that their partners will be disappointed or leave. This anxiety itself often worsens function and creates a self-fulfilling cycle. Kenneth was experiencing this with Ruth until they had an honest conversation.
What gets in the way? Performance anxiety and shame. Understanding what men consider great sex also requires addressing what gets in the way of it. Sex therapists consistently identify two major obstacles: performance anxiety and shame about aging bodies or decreased function. Both partners often carry these, and both undermine the authentic presence and emotional safety that creates satisfying sexuality at this age. Male performance anxiety centers on erectile function, duration, ability to satisfy partner. Men worry that decreased firm erections or inability to sustain them means they've failed, that they're no longer real men, that their partners will be disappointed or leave. This anxiety itself often worsens function and creates a self-fulfilling cycle. Kenneth was experiencing this with Ruth until they had an honest conversation. He'd been avoiding intimacy because he was anxious about function, which made Ruth think he wasn't attracted to her anymore. When they finally talked openly, Kenneth admitted his anxiety, and Ruth was able to reassure him that intercourse wasn't the only form of intimacy that mattered to her, that his worth as a lover wasn't reducible to erectile function, that she valued their entire physical and emotional connection. That conversation transformed their sexuality. Kenneth stopped avoiding intimacy, and without the performance pressure, function often improved naturally. But more importantly, they'd established that great sex didn't depend on specific physical performance. It depended on presence, connection, vulnerability, mutual pleasure in whatever forms their bodies could experience it. Shame about aging bodies affects both partners. Women worry that aging bodies aren't desirable. Men worry that decreased function means failure. Both carry internalized messages that sexuality belongs to youth, and that anything less than perfect physical performance is disappointment. Patricia and Martin addressed this directly by having vulnerable conversations about aging and sexuality. Patricia admitted her insecurity about her changing body, and Martin shared his anxieties about function. They made a conscious agreement to approach physical intimacy with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment toward themselves and each other. That agreement created space for sexuality that was about connection rather than performance, about pleasure rather than achievement. The practical application: address performance anxiety and body shame directly through honest conversation. Reassure each other that worth as lovers isn't determined by physical perfection or function. Create explicit agreement that sex is about connection, pleasure, presence, not performance metrics or meeting some imagined standard. That emotional work clears space for the authentic, vulnerable sexuality that men at this age actually consider great. Creating the conditions for great sex at this age. So what actually creates great sex, according to men over 60? It's the combination of all four secrets working together. Genuine desire expressed authentically. Let him know through words and actions that you want him, find him desirable. Choose to be intimate with him enthusiastically rather than obligatorily. Emotional safety for vulnerability. Create space where both of you can be honest about what you need, what's not working, insecurities, desires, without judgment or pressure to perform in vulnerability. Focus on quality and connection over frequency. Be fully present when you are intimate, prioritizing emotional engagement and authentic connection over checking boxes or meeting frequency targets. Embrace intimacy beyond intercourse. Explore the full range of physical closeness, touching, kissing, caressing, non-genital pleasure without reducing sex to a single act or treating everything else as lesser.
Ruth and Kenneth built their sexual relationship on these principles, and both report it's the most satisfying physical intimacy of their lives, not despite aging, but because of the emotional maturity and authentic presence they've learned through decades of living. "We're not performing for each other," Ruth explained. "We're just present, honestly, vulnerably, curiously present with each other's bodies and pleasure and connection. That presence creates intimacy I never experienced when I was younger and more worried about doing everything right."
What men over 60 consider great sex has evolved far beyond the performance-focused, frequency-oriented sexuality of younger years. At this age, men value genuine desire, emotional safety, quality over quantity, and physical intimacy that extends beyond intercourse. They want partners who show up with authentic enthusiasm, who can be vulnerable about needs and limitations, who prioritize connection over performance, who understand that sexuality is about far more than a single physical act. This is liberating news for women who've been anxious about aging bodies or uncertain about their continued sexual appeal. What men at this age actually want isn't physical perfection or athletic ability. It's presence, authenticity, genuine desire, and emotional intimacy. These are things that often improve with age rather than diminish, things you're likely more capable of offering now than you were in your 20s or 30s. If you've been worried about sexuality at this stage of life, let this be your permission to stop performing and start being present. Express genuine desire when you feel it. Create emotional safety for honest communication. Focus on quality of connection rather than frequency metrics. Explore physical intimacy beyond narrow definitions of real sex. These are the elements that create great sexual experiences according to the men you're actually with at this age. If this conversation gave you new perspective on sexuality after 60, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and join our community of women who are reclaiming every aspect of full, vibrant lives, including physical intimacy. We're having honest conversations here about topics others avoid. Until next time, remember that sexuality evolves with age, and what it evolves into can be richer and more satisfying than anything you experienced in your younger years. Show up authentically, communicate honestly, and let connection guide you.